Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Today I'm going to be telling you a bit about some of my dissertation research mechanisms behind the mate familiarity effect in a variable environment. There's a wide variety of reproductive strategies in the animal kingdom, ranging from very little parental care and no maintained relationships between partners outside of the actual mating event, to species that exhibit perennial monogamy, which is really where the mate familiarity effect comes into play, where individuals are socially monogamous, exhibit biparental care, and can maintain a relationship for the duration of their reproductive career. This is kind of a costly reproductive strategy, as it takes a lot of time and energy to develop and maintain a bond between partners. So there have to be some significant benefits in order for it to be evolutionarily viable. One of which is termed the mate familiarity effect, whereby individuals have enhanced reproductive success the longer they've been with a partner. Shown on the left here, some evidence for this from a 2014 paper, where you can see that there's a positive relationship between two different measures of reproductive success, brood size and the number of fledglings, as pair bond duration increases. One of the species where the mate familiarity effect has been pretty consistently demonstrated is Cassin's auklet, which is the species I'm working with. Cassin's auklet is a small, about potato size and shaped planktivorous seabird that exhibits long-term pair bonds. And at my field site on the Farallon Islands, there's a really good opportunity to actually study the mate familiarity effect in action, because this population has been monitored since the 1970s, and there's a lot of information on reproductive histories, and most of the birds are known age. So some really interesting evidence that's coming from my lab mate, Chris Tyson, demonstrates that the mate familiarity effect is particularly strong during poor years. Cassin's auklets are very sensitive to levels of coastal upwelling, and when upwelling is relatively weak, then they tend to have widespread reproductive failure. Shown here are the results of a simulation using data from the Farallons. And the thing to note here is that during years with relatively strong upwelling, all birds tend to have relatively high hatching probability regardless of pair experience level. Whereas in years with relatively weak upwelling, the more experienced birds are fairly unaffected and still have relatively high hatching probability, but these inexperienced birds have very low hatching probability. So it's really during these poor years that these experienced birds really shine. We thought that perhaps this was because of neglect, and that these experienced pairs were neglecting less during these poor years, but that turned out to actually not be the case. And during poor years, there are high rates of neglect in both experienced and inexperienced birds. So there's something that is allowing these experienced pairs to continue to be successful despite a relatively high rate of neglect equal to the inexperienced pairs. So this is where my research comes in. I'm interested in two hormones, Prolactin and Corticosterone, that might provide a mechanism for this. Prolactin is commonly associated with parental behavior, and higher levels tend to be associated with increased commitment to a reproductive attempt. Corticosterone is a well-studied glucocorticoid hormone. It's commonly studied in the context of stress, and baseline levels tend to be higher under stressful situations, such as the decreased food availability associated with lower upwelling. What I think is really interesting about these two hormones is that they have been proposed to have a negative relationship, whereby when corticosterone is higher, it tends to depress levels of prolactin. And what this means is that if corticosterone gets very high, it can lower prolactin to the point where the bird actually abandons the reproductive attempt and enters an emergency life history stage to to ensure its own survival. And in our system, what we think may be happening is that this relationship actually becomes uncoupled, where in these experienced pairs, even though corticosterone is relatively high, it has a weaker effect on prolactin, such that the birds are able to actually stick through the reproductive attempt and successfully fledge a chick. So to test this hypothesis, we measured prolactin and corticosterone in pairs across experience levels and ages in 2 years, in 2019, where there was relatively weak upwelling and high rates of reproductive failure, and 2021 with very strong upwelling and widespread reproductive success. Unfortunately, I don't have any results to actually share with you today, but this is kind of what we expect to see if the hypothesis is correct, where there's a negative relationship between prolactin and corticosterone across experience levels, but that it is weaker for experienced birds. And because 2021 was a relatively good year, we expect the points to generally be scattered somewhere over here with higher prolactin and lower corticosterone, but in 2019, for them to be scattered on the right side of this regression with relatively lower prolactin and higher corticosterone, but that this difference will be much less for experienced pairs. So what could this mean? So this might mean that what's allowing these experienced pairs to continue to be successful during poor years despite relatively high neglect is something akin to trust. So a bird that's in an experienced or an inexperienced pair will be equally likely to return to the nest from foraging and encounter their egg left alone. If they're experienced and have had a successful reproduction attempt with their partner before, the lower level of, or the lower impact of corticosterone on prolactin may allow them to actually return to incubating that egg. If they're inexperienced, in an inexperienced pair, the effect of corticosterone on prolactin will be stronger. And even though the bird may have an equally high level of corticosterone compared to a bird in an experienced pair, the effect on prolactin will be such that it actually abandons the egg. With that, I'd like to thank you for listening. I can't be here live to answer questions, but I'd like to invite you to please email me with any questions or comments. Thank you.